Good evening. Tonight, we embark on a journey through the life of perhaps the most paradoxical figure of the 20th century. A man who saved civilization from darkness, yet cast shadows of his own. A leader who inspired millions with words of defiance, while making decisions that would haunt generations. Winston Churchill, the bulldog of Britain, the voice that rallied a nation against tyranny, stands before us tonight not as a simple hero or villain, but as something far more complex, something far more human. Over the next hour, we will dissect the myth, examine the man, and ask the question that historians have debated for decades. Was Churchill the savior of the free world, or was he something else entirely? Before we march deeper into the trenches of history, pause for a moment and tell us in the comments below where you are watching from and what time it is in your corner of the world. Like the radio broadcasts that once crackled across continents during humanity's darkest hour, your voice reaches across time zones to join this conversation. And if you believe, as I do, that understanding our heroes' flaws is just as important as celebrating their triumphs, then subscribe now. Because the most dangerous myths are the ones we never question, and the most important truths are often the most uncomfortable ones. November 30th, 1874. In the grand halls of Blenheim Palace, a child is born who will one day hold the fate of nations in his hands. But on this cold autumn morning, Winston Leonard Spencer Churchill enters the world not as destiny's chosen one, but as a neglected son of privilege, a boy whose mother barely acknowledges his existence and whose father views him as a disappointment. Picture young Winston, red-haired and stocky, stammering through his lessons at Harrow School. His classmates mock his lisp, his teachers despair at his academic performance, and his father, Lord Randolph Churchill, a brilliant but unstable politician, refuses to attend a single speech day. "I have no intention of being bored by Winston's mediocrity," Lord Randolph reportedly told his wife. The boy who would one day craft the most stirring speeches in English literature could barely form a coherent sentence without stumbling. Yet within this awkward, lonely child burned something extraordinary. While other boys played cricket, Winston built elaborate fortresses with his collection of 1,500 toy soldiers, commanding imaginary armies through epic battles. He devoured books about military strategy and adventure, losing himself in tales of empire and glory. His nanny, Mrs. Everest, became his refuge, the one person who believed in him unconditionally. When she died, Winston wept openly, unashamed of his grief in an age when such emotion was considered weakness. At 24, Churchill was already courting controversy. As a war correspondent in the Sudan, he witnessed the Battle of Omdurman, where British forces slaughtered 10,000 Sudanese warriors using machine guns and artillery. While other correspondents glorified the victory, Churchill wrote with uncomfortable honesty. The infantry fired steadily and stolidly, without hurry or excitement, for the enemy came on like the sea, and like the sea they were swept away. Even then, Churchill possessed the dual nature that would define his entire career. He celebrated British military might while questioning its methods, glorified empire while recognizing its cruelties. This was not hypocrisy, but something more complex, a mind capable of holding contradictory truths simultaneously. His escape from a Boer prisoner of war camp in 1899 made him famous across the British Empire. The details read like adventure fiction. A young politician turned war correspondent, captured behind enemy lines, scaling the walls of a prison compound under cover of darkness, walking 300 miles through hostile territory, hiding in mine shafts, and finally reaching safety. Newspapers called him a hero. Critics called him a glory-seeking opportunist who had violated his parole as a non-combatant correspondent. Both were right. By 30, Churchill had already lived several lifetimes. War correspondent, prisoner of war, author, lecturer, and now member of Parliament. But his real education was just beginning, and it would come through a series of spectacular failures that would either destroy him or forge him into something unprecedented. April 25th, 1915. Dawn breaks over the rocky shores of the Gallipoli Peninsula as thousands of Australian and New Zealand soldiers wade through blood-red water toward an impossible beach. Machine gun fire rakes their ranks. Artillery shells tear through their formations. By sunset, the beaches are carpeted with bodies. and the British Empire's military reputation lies in ruins alongside them. The man responsible sits in his office at the Admiralty in London, his face grave as the telegrams pour in. Winston Churchill, First Lord of the Admiralty, architect of what would become known as one of the most disastrous military campaigns in British history. The Gallipoli campaign, his brainchild, his attempt to outflank the stalemate of trench warfare on the Western Front, had become a killing field. The plan had been audacious, perhaps brilliant. While other generals fed men into the meat grinder of French trenches, Churchill envisioned a naval assault through the Dardanelles that would knock the Ottoman Empire out of the war, open a supply route to Russia, and possibly end the conflict years earlier. On paper, it was strategic genius. In reality, it was a catastrophe that would cost over 130,000 Allied casualties. Churchill's critics were merciless. Churchill's folly, they called it. The madman's gamble. Prime Minister Herbert Asquith, bowing to public pressure and political necessity, dismissed Churchill from the Admiralty. At 41, Churchill's political career seemed finished. The newspapers wrote his political obituary. His own Conservative Party turned on him. He was, in the words of one contemporary, the most hated man in Britain. But here is where Churchill's true character emerged. A lesser man might have retreated into comfortable exile, written memoirs, accepted quiet positions on corporate boards. Churchill did something extraordinary. He requested a transfer to the Western Front as a common soldier. Picture this: a former cabinet minister, a man who had dined with kings and commanded fleets, now living in a muddy trench in France, sharing rations with working-class soldiers, leading night raids across no man's land. Lieutenant Colonel Churchill of the Royal Scots Fusiliers, carrying a rifle instead of wielding political power, facing the same bullets and gas attacks as the men whose lives his decisions had cost. His fellow officers expected arrogance, entitlement, the bearing of a man slumming among his inferiors. Instead, they found something else entirely. Churchill shared his chocolate rations, remembered the names of common soldiers, and when a German sniper's bullet missed his head by inches, he simply lit a cigar and continued writing dispatches. "The bullet passed so close," he wrote to his wife Clementine, "that I felt the wind of it. Yet I felt no fear, only curiosity about whether the next one would find its mark." The trenches taught Churchill lessons that no political office ever could. He learned what leadership looked like when your decisions killed people you knew personally. He discovered the weight of command when failure meant not just political embarrassment, but the death of boys barely out of school. Most importantly, he learned that true authority came not from position or privilege, but from sharing the same risks as those you led. When Churchill returned to politics in 1917, he was a different man. The aristocratic dilettante was gone, replaced by someone who understood viscerally what war cost and what leadership demanded. His critics still attacked him, but now their words carried less sting. How could you question the courage of a man who had voluntarily traded a minister's office for a rifle in the trenches? This transformation would prove essential in the years to come. For the next great test would not be a military campaign that failed, but a civilization hanging by a thread. And this time, Churchill would be ready. May 1940 finds Winston Churchill at age 65, climbing the steps of 10 Downing Street not in triumph, but in the ashes of political catastrophe. Britain stands alone against Nazi Germany. France is falling. The British Expeditionary Force is trapped at Dunkirk, and the man now tasked with saving Western civilization has spent the previous decade as a political outcast, dismissed by his own party as a warmonger and a relic. The wilderness years, as Churchill would later call them, began in 1929 when the Conservative Party lost power and Churchill lost his position as Chancellor of the Exchequer. But his exile was not merely electoral. Throughout the 1930s, as Hitler rose to power and Nazi Germany rearmed, Churchill's warnings fell on deliberately deaf ears. Week after week, he rose in the House of Commons to deliver prophetic speeches about the growing threat across the Channel. "Germany is arming fast, and no one is going to stop her," he declared in 1934. His fellow Conservative MPs yawned, chatted among themselves, or simply walked out. Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain regarded Churchill as an embarrassing anachronism, a man obsessed with past glories and unable to accept the modern reality of peaceful coexistence. But Churchill saw what others chose to ignore. Through a network of informants, sympathetic civil servants, and foreign intelligence sources, he tracked Germany's military buildup with the precision of a detective following a murder case. He knew the exact number of German aircraft being produced each month. He understood the strategic implications of the Rhineland remilitarization. He recognized that Hitler's speeches were not political rhetoric, but blueprints for conquest. "I have watched this famous island descending incontinently, fecklessly, the stairway which leads to a dark gulf," Churchill warned Parliament in 1936. "It is a fine broad stairway at the beginning, but after a bit the carpet ends. A little farther on there are only flagstones, and a little farther on still these break beneath your feet." The metaphor was perfect, and perfectly ignored. During these wilderness years, Churchill sustained himself through writing. His biography of his ancestor, the Duke of Marlborough, consumed 5 years and 4 volumes. His History of the English-Speaking Peoples stretched across centuries of human experience. But even his literary success carried political cost. Critics accused him of living in the past, of viewing the world through the lens of imperial glory rather than modern reality. They missed the point entirely. Churchill was not nostalgic for the past, but terrified for the future. His historical studies had taught him to recognize patterns that others missed. He had studied how civilizations fell, how democracies surrendered their freedoms through weakness and wishful thinking. He knew that evil, once unleashed, could not be appeased or reasoned with, only confronted. The Munich Agreement of 1938 vindicated Churchill's warnings in the most terrible way possible. While Chamberlain returned from Munich, waving his paper and proclaiming "peace for our time," Churchill rose in Parliament to deliver one of his most devastating speeches. "We have sustained a defeat without a war, the consequences of which will travel far with us along our road. They will affect the whole of Europe, and they will affect the most profoundly the position of the British Empire in the world." Even then, with Hitler's ambitions laid bare, Churchill's warnings were dismissed. Conservative MPs jeered at his warmongering. The press mocked his outdated imperialism. Chamberlain's policy of appeasement remained popular, with a public desperate to avoid another war like the one that had consumed a generation. But in the privacy of his study at Chartwell, his beloved country estate, Churchill prepared. He studied maps, analysed intelligence reports, and planned for a war that seemed inevitable to him alone. He understood that when the crisis came, Britain would need not just political leadership, but something more primal, the voice of defiance itself, the embodiment of absolute refusal to surrender. He was about to become exactly that. May 10th, 1940. As German panzer divisions smash through the Ardennes forest and Stukas scream down on Belgian cities, a political drama unfolds in London that will determine the fate of nations. Neville Chamberlain, the architect of appeasement, faces a vote of no confidence. His majority crumbles from 200 to just 81. The man who promised peace for our time can no longer govern in a time of total war. 2 men stand ready to replace him. Lord Halifax, the Foreign Secretary, elegant and aristocratic, favoured by King George VI and most of the conservative establishment, and Winston Churchill, the former outcast, distrusted by his own party, but increasingly seen as the only man capable of matching Hitler's ruthless determination. The choice seems obvious to the political establishment. Halifax represents continuity, respectability, the possibility of negotiated peace with Germany. Churchill represents what? Defiance without hope? A fight that cannot be won? But Lord Halifax understands something that others miss. This moment requires not a diplomat, but a warrior. Not someone who seeks compromise, but someone incapable of surrender. In a private meeting, Halifax removes himself from consideration. "I could not lead from the House of Lords," he tells colleagues. But his real reason goes deeper. He knows this war will demand a kind of leadership that aristocratic breeding cannot provide. And so, on May 10th, 1940, Winston Churchill becomes Prime Minister of Great Britain. He tells the King, "I hope it is not too late. I am very much afraid it is." That same day, Hitler launches his Western offensive. Within weeks, Holland falls, Belgium capitulates, and France, the great military power that had held the Kaiser's armies for 4 years, collapses in 6 weeks. By June, Britain stands alone. The Royal Navy rescues 338,000 troops from the beaches of Dunkirk, but they return without their equipment, their tanks, their artillery. The British Army has been effectively disarmed. Invasion seems inevitable. In Washington, American officials begin planning for a post-British world. Even Churchill's own Foreign Secretary, Lord Halifax, advocates exploring peace negotiations with Hitler. It is at this moment of absolute crisis that Churchill reveals the quality that will define not just his leadership, but the entire course of human history: his complete inability to contemplate surrender. This is not courage in any conventional sense. Courage implies the conquest of fear. Churchill seems to experience something different entirely, a kind of spiritual certainty that some fights must be fought regardless of their outcome. On June 4th, following the evacuation from Dunkirk, Churchill addresses the House of Commons. His words have been quoted countless times, but their power remains undimmed. "We shall go on to the end. We shall fight in France. We shall fight on the seas and oceans. We shall fight with growing confidence and growing strength in the air. We shall defend our island, whatever the cost may be. We shall fight on the beaches. We shall fight on the landing grounds. We shall fight in the fields and in the streets. We shall fight in the hills. We shall never surrender." This is not a strategy speech or a diplomatic statement. This is a primal roar, the sound of a civilization refusing to die quietly. And somehow, impossibly, this old man's voice becomes the voice of an entire people. But Churchill's finest moment is yet to come. On June 18th, with France fallen and Britain facing invasion, he delivers what many consider the greatest speech in the English language. "The Battle of France is over," he tells the nation. "The Battle of Britain is about to begin. Hitler knows that he will have to break us in this island or lose the war. If we can stand up to him, all Europe may be freed, and the life of the world may move forward into broad, sunlit uplands. But if we fail, then the whole world, including the United States, including all that we have known and cared for, will sink into the abyss of a new dark age made more sinister, and perhaps more protracted by the lights of perverted science." The speech concludes with words that still raise the hair on the back of your neck. "Let us therefore brace ourselves to our duties, and so bear ourselves that if the British Empire and its Commonwealth last for 1,000 years, men will still say, this was their finest hour." Finest hour. Two words that transform military catastrophe into moral victory, that make defeat sound like destiny. This is Churchill's genius. His ability to reframe reality through the sheer force of language, to make courage contagious through the magic of words. And it works. Somehow, incredibly, it works. August 15th, 1940. Above the fields of southern England, 1,000 German aircraft darken the summer sky. Below them, just 700 Hurricane and Spitfire fighters rise to meet them. The odds are impossible, the stakes absolute. If the Royal Air Force breaks, German invasion barges will cross the English Channel within days. Western civilization balances on the skills of boys barely out of school, flying machines held together by rivets and determination. In the underground bunker beneath Storey's Gate, Winston Churchill watches the battle unfold on plotting boards and radio reports. Each blip on the radar screen represents not just an aircraft, but the future itself. Young pilots, most not yet 21, engage in aerial combat above the villages where Shakespeare wrote his plays and Newton formulated his laws. They are fighting for more than territory. They are fighting for the very idea that free people can govern themselves. Churchill understands this with perfect clarity. This is not merely a military campaign, but a test of civilizational will. And his role is not that of a general commanding troops, but something more fundamental. He must become the voice of defiance itself, the human embodiment of absolute refusal to submit. Day after day, as the Battle of Britain rages overhead, Churchill visits airfields, talks with pilots, and watches young men take off knowing that 30% will not return. He sees boys who should be at university instead climbing into cockpits to face experienced German aces. Their average life expectancy in combat is measured in weeks, not years. Yet these young pilots display something that astonishes even Churchill. a casual, almost cheerful courage that treats mortal combat as though it were an especially dangerous sport. They speak in understatement and euphemism, calling death going for a Burton, and describing violent air battles as a bit of a scrap. This very British refusal to dramatize danger becomes itself a form of heroism. On August 20th, as the battle reaches its climax, Churchill addresses Parliament with words that transform these young pilots into legends. Never in the field of human conflict was so much owed by so many to so few. The phrase captures something essential about the moment. A handful of young men, many still teenagers, holding the line for all of human freedom. But Churchill's genius extends beyond memorable phrases. He understands that this war is being fought as much in the realm of psychology as on the battlefield. Every speech, every radio broadcast, every public appearance is carefully calculated to reinforce the message that Britain will never surrender. He appears at bombed churches, walks through rubble-strewn streets, and always projects absolute confidence in ultimate victory. The Blitz tests this resolve to its limits. Beginning in September 1940, German bombers attack British cities night after night for 8 months. London, Coventry, Birmingham, Liverpool, Plymouth, all suffer devastating raids. Entire neighbourhoods disappear in single nights. Thousands of civilians die in their homes, in underground stations, in shelters that prove inadequate against high explosives. Churchill's response becomes legendary. Instead of retreating to secure bunkers, he insists on touring bombed areas, often while raids are still ongoing. Photographs show him picking his way through rubble, cigar clenched between his teeth, giving his famous V for Victory sign to crowds of survivors. His presence seems to say, if an overweight, 66-year-old man can face the bombers, so can the rest of us. More importantly, Churchill grasps something that Hitler does not. The psychological effect of the Blitz is backfiring. Instead of breaking British morale, the bombing raids are actually strengthening it. Shared suffering creates shared determination. The sight of Buckingham Palace bombed becomes not a symbol of weakness, but of common cause. The King and Queen, like ordinary Londoners, have had their home attacked. Everyone is in this together. Churchill captures this spirit in one of his most powerful broadcasts. We are waiting for the long-promised invasion. So are the fishes. The line gets enormous laughs, but underneath the humour lies something deadly serious. Churchill is telling Hitler and the world that Britain not only refuses to surrender, but actually welcomes the challenge. Come ahead, he seems to say. We're ready for you. By May 1941, the Battle of Britain is won, and the Blitz has failed. Germany turns eastward toward Russia, abandoning plans for invasion. Britain, bloodied but unbroken, survives to fight another day. Churchill's voice, broadcast across the empire and around the world, has proven that words can indeed be weapons of war. But Churchill's greatest triumph contains the seeds of his greatest controversies. The very qualities that make him indispensable in 1940 will make him increasingly problematic as the war progresses and the post-war world takes shape. December 7th, 1941. Pearl Harbor burns under Japanese attack, and Winston Churchill, receiving the news in his study at Chequers, allows himself a moment of private elation. So we have won after all, he tells himself, understanding immediately that American entry into the war guarantees ultimate Allied victory. But this moment of triumph also marks the beginning of Churchill's decline from saviour to increasingly marginalised ally. The man who had stood alone against Hitler now finds himself the junior partner in a coalition dominated by Franklin Roosevelt, and increasingly Joseph Stalin. The empire Churchill represents is bleeding money and manpower, dependent on American lend-lease and Soviet lives. Britain's survival, the miracle of 1940, has been purchased at the price of its global dominance. Churchill struggles to adapt to this new reality. Throughout 1942 and 1943, as the war's momentum shifts decisively in favour of the Allies, Churchill fights increasingly desperate diplomatic battles to maintain British influence in post-war planning. He coins the phrase "special relationship" to describe Anglo-American cooperation, but Roosevelt often treats him more as a valued consultant than an equal partner. The tensions become acute in planning for D-Day. Churchill, haunted by memories of World War I's slaughter, advocates for alternative strategies, invasions through the Balkans, campaigns in Italy, anything to avoid another Somme on the beaches of Normandy. American military leaders view these proposals with suspicion, seeing them as attempts to preserve British imperial interests rather than win the war efficiently. But it is Churchill's attitude toward the Soviet Union that reveals the deepest contradictions of his leadership. The man who had been among the first to recognize the Nazi threat now finds himself allied with a regime that he knows to be equally tyrannical. In 1919, Churchill had been among the strongest advocates for military intervention against the Bolsheviks. Now he toasts Stalin as that great man and defends Soviet actions that he privately finds appalling. The contradiction torments Churchill. His speeches praise Soviet heroism and sacrifice, but his private communications reveal deep anxiety about post-war Soviet intentions. An iron curtain is drawn down upon their front, he cables Roosevelt after visiting the Eastern Front. We do not know what is going on behind. The phrase that will later define the Cold War emerges from Churchill's wartime recognition that Britain is helping to create a new threat to replace the one being defeated. This moral complexity deepens when we examine Churchill's wartime decisions more closely. The man celebrated for his unwavering principles makes choices that reveal a more pragmatic and sometimes ruthless character. The bombing of Dresden in February 1945, just months before Germany's surrender, kills tens of thousands of civilians in what many historians consider a militarily unnecessary attack. Churchill initially supports the operation, then distances himself from it as criticism mounts. Even more controversial is Churchill's role in the Bengal famine of 1943. As Japanese forces threaten British India, Churchill prioritizes military needs over civilian relief. When advisors plead for grain shipments to prevent mass starvation in Bengal, Churchill reportedly responds, "If food is so scarce, why hasn't Gandhi died yet?" Whether Churchill actually spoke these words remains debated, but his policies certainly contributed to a famine that killed millions. This reveals the most uncomfortable truth about Churchill's wartime leadership. The very qualities that made him indispensable in 1940 also made him capable of decisions that seem almost monstrous in hindsight. His absolute conviction, his inability to compromise, his willingness to sacrifice anything for victory. These traits saved Western civilization and cost countless lives. Churchill himself seems aware of this paradox. In quieter moments, he speaks of the burden of command in terms that reveal deep psychological cost. "I have nothing to offer but blood, toil, tears, and sweat," he had promised in 1940. By 1945, he has delivered exactly that, not just from his enemies, but from his allies and subjects as well. The Victory Parade in London on May 8, 1945, shows Churchill at the height of his fame and the beginning of his political decline. Millions cheer the man who led them through their finest hour. Yet even as crowds roar their approval, Churchill understands that his usefulness is ending. The empire he has saved is already fragmenting. The special relationship he cultivated with America is evolving into dependence. The Soviet ally he courted is becoming the next great threat. 2 months later, British voters decisively reject Churchill's Conservative Party, choosing instead a Labour government that promises social reform over continued imperial glory. The man who saved the nation is no longer the man the nation wants to lead it. The warrior prophet, essential in time of crisis, becomes expendable in time of peace. But Churchill's story is far from over. His greatest speech, his most prophetic warning, his final transformation from wartime leader to Cold War seer, still lies ahead. March 5th, 1946. In the gymnasium of Westminster College in Fulton, Missouri, a crowd of 2,800 people gathers to hear a speech that will reshape how the world understands itself. The speaker, just 9 months removed from Downing Street, stands at the podium not as a sitting prime minister, but as a private citizen. Yet his words this afternoon will prove more influential than most government policies, more lasting than most treaty negotiations. Winston Churchill, introduced by President Harry Truman himself, delivers what becomes known as the Iron Curtain speech. From Stettin in the Baltic to Trieste in the Adriatic, Churchill declares, An iron curtain has descended across the continent. With these words, the Cold War officially begins, not with military action, but with the power of metaphor. The speech is vintage Churchill, sweeping in scope, dramatic in language, uncomfortable in its implications. He warns of Soviet expansionism at a moment when most Americans and Britons want to believe that wartime cooperation with Stalin can continue in peace. He calls for Anglo-American unity when Britain's power is clearly waning. He demands vigilance when the world craves rest. Initial reaction is largely negative. American newspapers criticize Churchill for warmongering. Soviet officials denounce him as a fascist provocateur. Even many in Britain view the speech as an embarrassing attempt to drag America into imperial adventures. The London Times calls it inept and ill-timed. But Churchill has done it again. Just as he recognized the Nazi threat before others, he now identifies the Soviet challenge, while his contemporaries still hope for peaceful coexistence. Within 2 years, events in Czechoslovakia, Berlin, and Korea vindicate his warnings. The phrase Iron Curtain enters common usage, defining an entire historical epoch. This prescience reveals something crucial about Churchill's mind, his ability to see patterns that others miss, to understand that human nature does not change simply because circumstances do. He had studied enough history to know that totalitarian regimes, whether fascist or communist, expand until forcibly stopped. He understood that Stalin's Soviet Union, like Hitler's Germany, would respect only strength. Yet even as Churchill demonstrates his strategic brilliance, he also reveals the limitations of his worldview. The same speech that correctly predicts Soviet behavior also calls for continued white supremacy in Africa and Asia. Churchill speaks of the English-speaking peoples as though they are naturally destined to lead the world, blind to the reality that the age of European dominance is ending. This blindness becomes more pronounced as Churchill returns to power as Prime Minister in 1951. Now 77 years old, increasingly deaf and sometimes confused, he struggles to adapt to a world where Britain is clearly a second-tier power. He fights desperate rearguard actions to preserve the empire, resisting independence movements in Kenya, Egypt, and elsewhere. The Mau Mau uprising in Kenya particularly reveals Churchill's moral blind spots. His government authorizes the creation of detention camps, where suspected rebels are tortured and killed. Tens of thousands of Kikuyu civilians die in what amounts to a campaign of collective punishment. When criticized in Parliament, Churchill defends these actions as necessary to preserve civilization against barbarism. This is the same man who stood against Nazi tyranny, now authorizing methods that differ in scale, but not in kind, from those he once condemned. The contradiction seems inexplicable until we understand that Churchill never viewed the empire and democracy as contradictory concepts. In his mind, British rule brought civilization to backward peoples. Resistance to that rule was by definition barbaric. This imperial mindset also shapes Churchill's response to the Suez Crisis in 1956. Though no longer Prime Minister, he strongly supports Anthony Eden's disastrous attempt to reclaim the Suez Canal through military force. When the operation collapses in the face of American opposition and international condemnation, Churchill seems genuinely bewildered. How could Britain's oldest ally abandon her in defense of empire? The answer, of course, is that America had never shared Britain's imperial assumptions. President Eisenhower views the Suez intervention not as a defense of civilization, but as outdated imperialism that threatens American interests in the Middle East. The special relationship, Churchill's greatest diplomatic achievement, proves insufficient to overcome this fundamental disagreement about the nature of the post-war world. Churchill's final years in politics are marked by increasing irrelevance. The world he understood, the world of empire and great power politics, is giving way to something entirely new: decolonization, nuclear deterrence, economic interdependence. Churchill grasps some of these changes. He advocates for European unity and warns about nuclear weapons, but he cannot fully adapt to them. His last major speech in Parliament, delivered in 1955, captures both his enduring wisdom and his tragic limitations. He warns of the dangers of nuclear war with the same prescience he once brought to warnings about Hitler and Stalin. Yet he also speaks nostalgically of Britain's imperial past, as though it represented a golden age, rather than a system built on the subjugation of hundreds of millions of people. January 24th, 1965. As Big Ben tolls across a frozen London, Winston Churchill lies dying in his bed at Hyde Park Gate. The great voice that once rallied a nation is now reduced to whispers. The hands that once gestured dramatically before crowds can barely lift a teacup. Yet even in these final hours, the contradictions that defined his life remain unresolved. Outside, television crews from around the world prepare for the most elaborate funeral in British history. Inside, family members keep vigil over a man whose legacy grows more complex with each passing decade. The hero of 1940 is also the architect of imperial violence. The prophet of the Iron Curtain is also the defender of racial supremacy. The savior of democracy is also the champion of empire. To understand Churchill's full legacy, we must examine not just what he did, but how his words shaped reality. No political leader in history has understood better the power of language to transform perception, to make the impossible seem inevitable, the unbearable become endurable. Churchill's speeches during World War II did not simply describe events. They created a narrative framework that allowed Britain to continue fighting when logic suggested surrender. Consider the Dunkirk evacuation. Military historian Basil Liddell Hart called it the greatest military disaster in British history. Churchill transformed it into a miracle of deliverance through the sheer power of rhetoric. The British Expeditionary Force had been decisively defeated, its equipment abandoned, its casualties enormous. Yet Churchill's words made tactical defeat sound like moral victory, creating a mythology that sustained British resistance for 4 more years. This was not mere propaganda, but something more profound: the creation of meaning through language. Churchill understood that human beings need stories to make sense of suffering, narratives that transform random events into purposeful struggle. His genius lay in crafting stories that were simultaneously true and misleading, inspiring and manipulative. The Finest Hour speech exemplifies this technique. Churchill takes a moment of maximum vulnerability and reframes it as a moment of maximum glory. Britain stands alone not because it has been abandoned by allies, but because it has been chosen by destiny. The speech creates a psychological reality that makes continued resistance not just possible, but inevitable. Yet this same mastery of language also enabled Churchill's moral failures. His speeches about empire consistently portrayed British rule as a civilizing mission rather than economic exploitation. He described resistance to imperial authority as barbarism rather than legitimate nationalism. The words that saved democracy in Europe also justified tyranny in Africa and Asia. This dual nature extends to Churchill's personal relationships. Colleagues describe him as both inspiring and exhausting, generous and selfish, loyal and ruthless. His secretary, Elizabeth Leighton, recalls working 18-hour days as Churchill dictated correspondence, while pacing around his study in silk pajamas, cigar smoke creating clouds that obscured his face. He was simultaneously the most considerate and most demanding boss she ever knew. His marriage to Clementine Churchill reveals similar contradictions. Their correspondence, spanning over 50 years, shows genuine love and mutual respect. Yet Clementine often had to manage not just household affairs, but Churchill's emotional volatility, his black periods of depression that he called his black dog. She was partner, nurse, political advisor, and psychological anchor to a man whose public strength masked private fragility. Churchill's relationship with alcohol presents another complexity. Critics frequently accused him of being a drunk, pointing to his legendary consumption of champagne, whiskey, and brandy throughout the day. Yet his productivity remained enormous, his judgment during critical moments sound. Perhaps alcohol was not a weakness, but a form of self-medication, a way of managing the enormous pressures of leadership during humanity's darkest hours. His writing reveals yet another facet of his character. Churchill produced over 40 books, won the Nobel Prize for Literature, and earned more money from his pen than from politics. His prose style, ornate and dramatic, reflects his understanding that history is not simply a record of events, but a form of storytelling that shapes how future generations understand their past. "History will be kind to me," Churchill once remarked, "for I intend to write it. and indeed, his own historical works, particularly his 6-volume memoir of World War II, have profoundly influenced how that conflict is remembered. But this raises uncomfortable questions about the relationship between power and narrative, between the actors in historical events and those who record them. Churchill's version of World War II inevitably emphasizes his own role while minimizing Britain's dependence on allies, particularly the Soviet Union. Soviet casualties, over 20 million dead, receive far less attention than British suffering. The contributions of colonial troops fighting for an empire that denied them basic rights are barely mentioned. The Holocaust, perhaps the war's central moral issue, appears more as backdrop than central theme. This selective memory reflects not deliberate dishonesty, but the natural tendency of all memoirists to cast themselves as the hero of their own story. Yet when the memoirist is also one of history's principal actors, such selectivity shapes collective memory in profound ways. Churchill's account of World War II has become, for many in the English-speaking world, the definitive version of events. The power of this narrative becomes clear when we consider how different the war looks from other perspectives. Soviet historians emphasize the Eastern Front, where the majority of German forces were deployed and defeated. Indian historians note that the Bengal famine killed more people than the London Blitz. African historians point out that colonial resources and manpower were essential to Allied victory. None of these perspectives invalidates Churchill's achievements, but they complicate the simple story of one man saving civilization through force of will. The truth, as always, is more complex than any single narrative can capture. The year 1947 marks a turning point, not just in world history, but in Winston Churchill's understanding of his own legacy. As he watches the Union Jack lowered over India for the last time, Churchill witnesses the beginning of the end of the empire he had spent his life defending. The jewel in the crown of British rule gains independence, and with it goes any hope of maintaining Britain's status as a global superpower. Churchill's response reveals the depth of his imperial convictions. Even out of power, he condemns the partition of India as a betrayal of Britain's imperial mission. "The fearful massacres which are occurring in India are no surprise to me," he writes to a friend. "We are, of course, only at the beginning of these horrors and butcheries, perpetrated upon one another with the ferocity of cannibals, by races gifted with the capacities for the highest culture, and who had for generations lived side by side in general peace under the broad, tolerant, and impartial rule of the British Crown and Parliament." The language is revealing. In Churchill's mind, colonial peoples are races rather than nations, capable of culture only under British guidance, naturally prone to savagery without imperial control. The violence that accompanies partition, which kills perhaps 1 million people, becomes, in his narrative, proof of Indian incapacity for self-government, rather than evidence of imperial failure. This mindset explains Churchill's fierce opposition to decolonization throughout the 1950s. When the Gold Coast, now Ghana, moves toward independence, Churchill warns of chaos and barbarism. When Cyprus seeks self-determination, he advocates military suppression. When Egypt nationalizes the Suez Canal, he supports armed intervention. Each retreat from empire feels to Churchill like a betrayal of civilization itself. Yet Churchill's imperial vision was always more complex than simple racism, though racism certainly played a role. He genuinely believed that British rule brought order, justice, and progress to backward societies. In his mind, the empire was not primarily an instrument of exploitation, but a civilizing mission, a way of extending British values of law and liberty to peoples not yet capable of governing themselves. This paternalistic worldview explains many of Churchill's most controversial positions. His opposition to Indian independence stemmed not from hatred of Indians, but from conviction that they were not ready for democracy. His support for white minority rule in southern Africa reflected belief that only European settlers could maintain civilized government. His dismissal of African nationalism arose from assumption that tribal societies lacked the sophistication for modern statecraft. These assumptions, commonplace in Churchill's generation, became increasingly untenable as the 20th century progressed. The success of independent India, the achievements of African leaders like Kwame Nkrumah and Julius Nyerere, the obvious failures of white minority governments in Rhodesia and South Africa, All contradicted Churchill's imperial theories, but Churchill never fully acknowledged these contradictions. In his final years, he continued to speak of empire as though it remained a moral imperative rather than an outdated system of control. His last major political campaign, in the 1955 general election, featured promises to restore British greatness through imperial revival, promises that voters increasingly recognized as fantasies. This inability to adapt reveals a crucial limitation in Churchill's character, the same mental rigidity that made him effective in crisis. His absolute refusal to compromise with Hitler, his unwavering determination during the Blitz, also made him incapable of recognizing when circumstances had fundamentally changed. The empire that had seemed permanent in 1900 was clearly doomed by 1950, but Churchill could not accept this reality. His private papers from this period reveal a man struggling to understand a world that no longer makes sense to him. The America he had courted as an ally now leads the movement for decolonization. The United Nations he had helped create becomes a forum for anti-imperial rhetoric. The English-speaking peoples he had championed begin questioning the very assumptions on which their unity was based. Most painfully for Churchill, his own Conservative Party begins distancing itself from his imperial vision. Younger politicians like Harold Macmillan understand that Britain's future lies in Europe and the Commonwealth, not in futile attempts to preserve colonial rule. Churchill's speeches about empire, once stirring calls to duty, begin sounding like the nostalgic ramblings of an old man living in the past. This transformation from prophet to anachronism happens with startling speed. The Churchill who correctly predicted the Nazi threat and the Soviet challenge proves incapable of understanding the nationalist movements that reshape the post-war world. The man who grasped the significance of nuclear weapons cannot comprehend the significance of decolonization. Yet even in error, Churchill reveals aspects of his character that command respect. His imperial convictions, however misguided, spring from genuine belief in human progress and British responsibility. His resistance to change reflects not mere selfishness, but principled commitment to values he considers eternal. His refusal to adapt demonstrates the same strength of character that made him indispensable in 1940, even when that strength becomes counterproductive. January 30th, 1965. Sir Winston Churchill dies at age 90, exactly 70 years to the day after his father's death. The symmetry seems appropriate for a man who spent his life conscious of historical patterns and symbolic meanings. As news of his death spreads around the world, an extraordinary thing happens. Even his critics pause to acknowledge that something irreplaceable has been lost. The state funeral that follows is the largest in British history. Representatives from 112 nations gather in St. Paul's Cathedral. The ceremony is broadcast to 350 million people worldwide. From the gun carriage carrying his coffin to the cranes of London's docklands, bowing in silent tribute as his funeral barge passes down the Thames, every detail emphasizes Churchill's unique place in history. Yet even as the world mourns, the complexities of Churchill's legacy remain unresolved. The man being honored as the savior of democracy was also the defender of empire. The champion of freedom was also the architect of oppression. The voice of moral clarity was also the advocate of racial hierarchy. These contradictions have only become more apparent with time. Documents released decades after Churchill's death reveal the full extent of his role in events like the Bengali famine and the suppression of the Mau Mau uprising. His private comments about race, long whispered about but officially denied, are now matters of historical record. His imperial policies, once defended as necessary for global stability, are now recognized as forms of systematic exploitation. Modern historians have subjected Churchill's reputation to systematic revision. Academic studies emphasize his failures as much as his successes, his prejudices as much as his insights. Popular biographies explore his psychological complexity, his struggles with depression, his complicated relationships with family and colleagues. The simple narrative of heroic leadership has given way to something more nuanced, but also more troubling. This revisionist approach has generated significant controversy. Churchill's defenders argue that judging him by contemporary standards is both anachronistic and unfair. They point out that his racial attitudes, however offensive today, were typical of his generation and class. They emphasized that his imperial policies, whatever their human cost, were implemented during times of crisis when alternatives seemed unavailable. More fundamentally, they argue that Churchill's role in defeating Nazi Germany outweighs all other considerations. Without his leadership in 1940, they contend, Hitler might have conquered Europe, the Holocaust might have claimed even more victims, and the very values that now allow us to criticize imperialism might never have survived. This argument has considerable force. It is difficult to imagine any other British politician providing the kind of leadership Churchill offered during the summer of 1940. His combination of strategic insight, rhetorical genius, and sheer bloody-minded determination seems to have been precisely what the moment required. The question is whether these qualities justify overlooking his moral failures in other contexts. Churchill's critics reject this reasoning as a form of moral accounting that places one set of lives above another. They argue that his admirers engage in selective empathy, mourning German victims of Allied bombing while ignoring Indian victims of imperial policy, celebrating British resistance while dismissing colonial resistance as terrorism. They point out that Churchill's finest hour was also Britain's finest hour, partly because it coincided with Empire's darkest hour. The resources that sustained British resistance came largely from colonies that had no voice in the decision to fight. Indian soldiers died defending democracy in Europe while being denied democracy at home. African miners extracted the minerals that built British weapons while living under systems of racial oppression. This debate reflects broader questions about how societies should remember their past. Should historical figures be judged by the standards of their time or ours? Should their achievements excuse their failures, or should their failures overshadow their achievements? How do we balance the need for inspiring narratives with the obligation to historical truth? Churchill himself would probably have enjoyed these debates. He understood better than most that history is not simply a record of events, but an ongoing conversation between past and present. His own historical writings consistently emphasized that different generations would necessarily interpret the past differently, finding new meanings and drawing new lessons from familiar events. The empires of the future, Churchill once predicted, are the empires of the mind. He understood that political power increasingly depended on the ability to shape how people think rather than simply control how they behave. His mastery of this new form of empire, the empire of ideas and narratives, explains both his enduring influence and the intensity of contemporary debates about his legacy. If we could somehow bring Winston Churchill back to witness the world of 2024, what would he make of it? The British Empire he defended has vanished entirely. The racial hierarchies he accepted as natural have been formally abolished. The European unity he eventually advocated has become reality, though without Britain. The nuclear weapons he warned about have proliferated beyond his worst nightmares. Yet in other ways, the world might seem familiar to him. Authoritarian leaders still threaten democratic societies. The English-speaking peoples he championed still cooperate in defense of shared values. The power of words to shape reality, which he understood so well, has been amplified by technologies he could never have imagined. Consider how Churchill might view Vladimir Putin's Russia. The parallels with his own warnings about Hitler and Stalin would be impossible to miss. A European dictator using nationalism and historical grievance to justify territorial expansion. Democratic societies reluctant to confront aggression until forced to do so. The necessity of American leadership in organizing resistance to authoritarian expansion. Churchill would probably recognize the pattern and advocate for firm response, just as he did in the 1930s and 1940s. But he might also be troubled by the complexity of modern geopolitics, where clear moral lines are harder to draw and military solutions carry risks he never had to consider. The rise of China presents an even more complex challenge. Churchill understood great power competition instinctively, but the emergence of a non-Western superpower might have challenged his assumptions about the natural leadership of English-speaking peoples. Would he have adapted to a multipolar world, or would he have advocated for renewed Western unity to maintain global dominance? On matters of race and empire, Churchill would find himself completely out of step with contemporary values. The success of post-colonial societies, the achievement of racial equality in law if not always in practice, the recognition that diversity strengthens rather than weakens societies. All these developments contradict his fundamental assumptions about human nature and social organization. Yet Churchill's defenders might argue that his core insights remain valid even if his specific positions have been superseded. His belief in the superiority of democratic governance, his conviction that free societies must sometimes fight to preserve their freedom, his understanding that words and ideas shape reality as much as material forces, all these insights remain relevant. More controversially, some argue that Churchill's warnings about the fragility of civilization have proven prophetic. The rise of authoritarianism in established democracies, the spread of political violence and extremism, the breakdown of shared narratives about truth and reality, all suggest that the values Churchill defended remain under threat. This perspective sees contemporary debates about Churchill as part of a broader struggle over Western civilization's future. Critics who emphasize his imperial legacy and racial prejudices are, in this view, undermining the very foundations of the free societies that make such criticism possible. Defenders who ignore his moral failures are, conversely, perpetuating the myths that enabled those failures. The truth, as always with Churchill, is more complex than either simple condemnation or uncritical praise allows. He was neither the unblemished hero of wartime mythology nor the racist villain of revisionist history. He was something more difficult to categorize. A human being of extraordinary abilities and ordinary prejudices, shaped by his historical moment, but also capable of transcending it. His speeches during World War II demonstrate this complexity perfectly. They drew their power partly from imperial assumptions that we now reject, but they also articulated universal principles that we still embrace. The voice that called for resistance to Nazi tyranny was the same voice that justified British rule over unwilling subjects. The mind that understood the necessity of fighting for freedom was the same mind that could not imagine extending that freedom to all peoples. This paradox suggests that moral progress is not simply a matter of replacing bad people with good people, but of expanding our understanding of who deserves moral consideration. Churchill's generation took for granted that some human beings were naturally suited to rule, while others were naturally suited to be ruled. Our generation takes for granted that all human beings possess equal dignity and rights. Yet we should be humble about our own moral blind spots. Future generations will doubtless identify assumptions that we take for granted as natural truths, but that they will recognize as forms of prejudice and oppression. The same historical process that has exposed Churchill's limitations will expose our own. As we reach the end of our journey through Winston Churchill's life and legacy, we confront the fundamental questions that his story raises about leadership, morality, and historical memory. These questions have no easy answers, but they demand our attention because they illuminate not just Churchill's character, but our own relationship with power and responsibility. The first question is whether great leadership necessarily involves moral compromise. Churchill's admirers argue that his finest hour required him to make impossible choices under extreme circumstances. Allied victory demanded cooperation with Stalin's murderous regime. British survival required exploiting colonial resources without regard for colonial welfare. The bombing of German cities, however morally questionable, helped end a war that was consuming millions of lives. This utilitarian logic has considerable force. Political leaders, unlike moral philosophers, cannot afford the luxury of pure principles. They must work with the world as it is, not as they wish it were. They must balance competing goods and choose between different evils. In such circumstances, moral purity becomes a form of moral abdication. Yet critics respond that this argument proves too much. If any means can be justified by sufficiently noble ends, then there are no meaningful moral constraints on political action. The leader who authorizes torture to prevent terrorism, the general who targets civilians to end war more quickly, the politician who lies to voters to implement beneficial policies, all can claim the same utilitarian justification that Churchill's defenders offer. The second question concerns the relationship between individual agency and historical forces. Churchill's supporters emphasize his personal role in changing history. Without his leadership, Britain might have surrendered in 1940, Nazi Germany might have won World War II, and the entire course of human development might have been different. But historians increasingly emphasize structural factors that limited any individual's influence on events. Germany's strategic position made long-term victory unlikely, regardless of British actions. The entry of the United States and Soviet Union into the war made Allied victory probable regardless of Churchill's leadership. The end of empire was driven by economic and social forces beyond any politician's control. This perspective suggests that Churchill was less the author of history than its instrument, less the great man who shaped events than the product of circumstances that required exactly his combination of strengths and weaknesses. His imperial prejudices, far from being irrelevant personal failings, were essential to his effectiveness in mobilizing an imperial war effort. The third question involves our responsibility as inheritors of Churchill's legacy. If we acknowledge both his achievements and his failures, how should this knowledge shape our own political choices? Should we celebrate leaders who deliver results regardless of their methods? Or should we insist on moral purity even at the cost of political effectiveness? Recent history offers troubling examples of both approaches. Leaders who promise moral clarity often prove ineffective in practice. Unable to navigate the compromises that governance requires, leaders who prioritize results often prove willing to sacrifice any principle for temporary advantage, corroding the very institutions they claim to defend. Churchill's example suggests that the choice between effectiveness and morality may be false. His greatest achievements came not when he abandoned his principles, but when he found ways to align his principles with practical necessity. His speeches during World War II worked precisely because they combined moral vision with realistic assessment of what victory would require. Conversely, his greatest failures came when he allowed practical considerations to override moral judgment, or when he clung to outdated principles despite changed circumstances. His imperial policies failed not just because they were morally wrong, but because they were strategically counterproductive, generating the very resistance they were designed to prevent. This suggests a fourth question. How do we distinguish between principles worth preserving and assumptions that need updating? Churchill's commitment to democratic governance and individual freedom remains admirable. His assumptions about racial hierarchy and imperial necessity now seem obviously wrong. But this clarity comes only with historical hindsight. Contemporary leaders face the same challenge Churchill did, distinguishing between eternal principles and temporary circumstances, between moral imperatives and cultural prejudices. The fact that we can now see Churchill's blind spots clearly does not mean that we can see our own with similar clarity. The final question concerns memory itself. How should democratic societies remember flawed leaders? Should we focus on their achievements to inspire future generations, or should we emphasize their failures to guard against repetition? Should historical narratives comfort the afflicted or afflict the comfortable? Churchill's own approach to history suggests that the answer involves both perspectives. His historical writings consistently emphasized human complexity, showing how the same individuals could embody both heroic and tragic qualities. He understood that history's purpose was not to provide simple moral lessons, but to illuminate the full range of human possibility. The longer you can look back, Churchill once observed, the farther you can look forward. This insight suggests that honest historical memory, acknowledging both achievements and failures, provides the best foundation for future decision-making. Societies that mythologize their past leaders risk repeating their mistakes. Societies that demonize their past leaders risk abandoning their achievements. Churchill's legacy, properly understood, offers neither simple inspiration nor simple condemnation, but something more valuable, a complex example of how extraordinary individuals navigate extraordinary circumstances. His story reminds us that history is made not by perfect people, but by flawed human beings who must choose between imperfect options under conditions of uncertainty and pressure. The bronze statue of Winston Churchill in Parliament Square stands with its back to the Houses of Parliament, facing east toward the threats he once identified and the challenges he could not foresee. Tourists photograph themselves beside it daily, most knowing little more about Churchill than his role in World War II. The myth has overtaken the man, as myths do, simplifying complexity into inspiration, transforming contradictions into clarity. But myths, however necessary, are also dangerous. They encourage us to look for simple heroes in complex times, to expect individual leaders to solve structural problems, to believe that good intentions guarantee good outcomes. The real Churchill, the man behind the myth, offers more valuable lessons precisely because he was more complicated than the bronze figure suggests. He shows us that leadership is not about possessing perfect character, but about rising to meet the demands of historical moments. That moral progress comes not from replacing flawed people with perfect ones, but from expanding our understanding of who deserves moral consideration, that the same qualities that make someone indispensable in crisis may make them problematic in normal times. Most importantly, Churchill's story reminds us that we are all products of our time, shaped by assumptions that future generations will find as questionable as we now find his imperial convictions. This recognition should inspire both humility about our own limitations and determination to do better than our predecessors. The Churchill who emerges from this examination is neither the unblemished hero of wartime propaganda, nor the irredeemable villain of revisionist history. He is something more human and more useful, a complex individual who responded to extraordinary circumstances with a mixture of wisdom and blindness, courage and prejudice, insight and delusion that mirrors our own moral complexity. In the end, perhaps that is Churchill's greatest gift to history. Not the inspiration of perfect heroism, but the recognition that flawed human beings can still accomplish extraordinary things. That democracy survives not because it produces perfect leaders, but because it provides mechanisms for correcting their mistakes. That moral progress happens not through the replacement of bad people by good people, but through the gradual expansion of human sympathy and understanding. The voice that once rallied a nation against darkness continues to speak, but its message is more complex than simple defiance. It reminds us that civilization is fragile, that freedom requires constant vigilance, and that the price of both is often paid by those who have the least voice in determining policy. It warns us that good intentions without good judgment can produce terrible results, but also that the absence of leadership in crisis can produce results that are even worse. As the sun sets on this examination of Churchill's life and legacy, we are left not with easy answers, but with essential questions. How do we balance the demands of leadership with the requirements of morality? How do we preserve what is valuable in our traditions while rejecting what is harmful? How do we learn from the past without being imprisoned by it? These questions have no final answers, only provisional ones that each generation must discover for itself. Winston Churchill, for all his flaws and all his achievements, remains a guide to these eternal challenges, not because he solved them perfectly, but because he grappled with them honestly. In a world that often seems to demand either hero worship or complete condemnation, Churchill's complex legacy offers a third option: the recognition that human beings, including those we entrust with power, are capable of both greatness and terrible error, often simultaneously. The Iron Curtain Churchill identified has fallen. The empire he defended has vanished. The racial hierarchies he accepted have been formally abolished. But the fundamental challenges he faced, the tension between power and morality, between effectiveness and principle, between the demands of the moment and the judgment of history, remain as relevant today as they were in his time. In facing these challenges, we would do well to remember both the Churchill who saved democracy and the Churchill who defended empire, both the voice that inspired millions and the decisions that cost countless lives. For it is only by acknowledging the full complexity of the past that we can hope to navigate the complexities of the present and future. The man was flawed. The myth is dangerous. But the questions Churchill's life raises about leadership, morality, and human nature remain essential. And in a world where authoritarianism again threatens democracy, where ancient prejudices persist despite moral progress, and where the power of words to shape reality has never been greater, those questions demand our continued attention. Winston Churchill was indeed both a hero and a problem. Understanding why he was both may be the key to ensuring that future leaders learn from his achievements while avoiding his mistakes. History will be kind to him, as he predicted, but only if we remember him fully, honestly, and with clear eyes about both his greatness and his limitations. The bronze statue will continue to stand in Parliament Square, facing east toward challenges yet to come. But the real monument to Churchill's legacy lies not in bronze or marble, but in our continued commitment to grappling with the moral complexities that his life exemplifies. For in the end, that may be the greatest gift any historical figure can offer. Not perfect answers, but essential questions that each generation must answer anew. Before we close this examination, we must delve deeper into the most unsettling aspects of Churchill's legacy, the ones that his admirers prefer to gloss over and his critics use to demolish his reputation entirely. For it is in these darkest corners that we find the most important lessons about power, prejudice, and the human capacity for both moral blindness and moral clarity. Let us return to Bengal, 1943. While Churchill coordinates the war effort from his bunker beneath London, 3 million people die of starvation in British India. This is not a natural disaster, but a man-made catastrophe, the result of policies that prioritize military objectives over civilian lives. The details are horrifying in their bureaucratic precision. British authorities continue exporting rice from Bengal, even as famine spreads. Military stockpiles receive priority over civilian distribution. Relief efforts are delayed, reduced, and sometimes abandoned entirely. When provincial officials plead for emergency food imports, they are told that shipping cannot be spared from military operations. Churchill's personal role in these decisions remains debated among historians, but the evidence suggests a pattern of callous indifference rather than deliberate genocide. When informed of the crisis, he responds not with urgency, but with irritation. The famine disrupts his war planning. The requests for aid interfere with military priorities. The suffering of Bengali peasants registers, if at all, as a distant abstraction. This reveals something crucial about the nature of imperial power. It creates psychological distance between rulers and ruled that enables unspeakable cruelty. Churchill could feel genuine anguish over British casualties while remaining unmoved by colonial suffering, not because he was inherently evil, but because imperial ideology trained him to see some lives as more valuable than others. The same psychological mechanism that allowed Churchill to authorize the bombing of Dresden operates in Bengal. Strategic objectives justify tactical brutality. Military necessity trumps humanitarian concern. The greater good, as defined by those in power, permits the sacrifice of those without power. Yet we must resist the temptation to dismiss Churchill as simply a monster. Monsters are easy to identify and condemn. The more disturbing truth is that Churchill was a decent man by the standards of his time and class, a loving husband and father, a loyal friend, someone capable of genuine kindness and generosity in his personal relationships. This is what makes his imperial policies so unsettling. They demonstrate that ordinary human beings, people we might like and admire in other contexts, are capable of participating in systems of oppression that cause immense suffering. The bureaucrat who processes deportation orders, the soldier who follows illegal commands, the politician who justifies collective punishment, all may be individually decent while collectively monstrous. Churchill's private papers from this period reveal a man struggling, however inadequately, with these moral complexities. He understands that empire involves violence and exploitation, but he convinces himself that this violence serves higher purposes. British rule may be harsh, but it prevents tribal warfare. Imperial extraction may impoverish colonies, but it funds global security. Individual injustices may occur, but they serve civilizational progress. These rationalizations seem transparently self-serving now, but they felt genuine to Churchill and his contemporaries. They believed, with sincere conviction, that they were serving humanity by extending British control over backward peoples. The suffering they caused was regrettable but necessary, temporary discomfort in service of permanent improvement. To understand how intelligent, well-meaning people can support such obviously unjust systems, we must examine the psychological foundations of Churchill's worldview. His racial attitudes were not simply crude prejudice, but elaborate intellectual constructions that seem to explain and justify imperial domination. Churchill believed in a hierarchy of civilizations with Anglo-Saxon peoples at the top, other Europeans in the middle, and non-European peoples at various lower levels. This hierarchy was not fixed. Peoples could advance through contact with superior civilizations, but it was natural, reflecting inherent differences in capacity for self-government, cultural achievement, and moral development. This framework allowed Churchill to view himself as genuinely benevolent, while advocating policies that we now recognize as deeply oppressive. In his mind, British rule improved the lot of subject peoples by exposing them to superior institutions and ideas. Resistance to this rule reflected not legitimate nationalism, but primitive inability to recognize their own best interests. Consider Churchill's response to the Indian independence movement. He genuinely could not understand why Indians would prefer self-government to British administration. In his view, British officials were more competent, more honest, and more committed to justice than any indigenous alternative. Independence would mean not freedom, but chaos. Not progress, but regression to barbarism. This paternalistic racism was arguably more pernicious than crude racial hatred because it presented itself as kindness. The plantation owner who claimed to love his slaves, the colonial administrator who spoke of civilizing missions, the politician who advocated racial segregation for the protection of inferior peoples, all drew on similar psychological mechanisms. Churchill's speeches about empire consistently employ the language of responsibility, rather than exploitation. Britain does not rule India for economic advantage, but from duty to less fortunate peoples. The empire is not a system of domination, but a family of nations under benevolent guidance. Imperial wars are not conquests, but police actions against disturbers of peace. This self-deception was so complete that Churchill seems to have genuinely believed his own propaganda. When critics accused him of racism, he responded with hurt surprise. How could extending British civilization to backward peoples be considered racist? How could anyone interpret benevolent paternalism as oppression? The answer, of course, is that paternalism is a form of oppression, perhaps the most insidious form, because it denies the humanity of those it claims to protect. By defining subject peoples as children incapable of self-government, imperial ideology justified treating them as children regardless of their actual capabilities or desires. This psychological dynamic helps explain why decolonization was so traumatic for people like Churchill. The success of independent nations contradicted fundamental assumptions about human nature and social organization. If Indians could govern themselves effectively, if Africans could build successful modern states, if non-European peoples could master science and technology, then what justified European domination in the first place? Rather than question these assumptions, Churchill preferred to deny contradictory evidence. Independent India's achievements were dismissed as temporary anomalies. African successes were attributed to continued European influence. The obvious competence of non-European leaders was explained away as exceptional rather than typical. Churchill's imperial policies were not simply expressions of personal prejudice, but applications of sophisticated technologies of control developed over centuries of colonial rule. These technologies, administrative, military, psychological, shaped not just how empire functioned, but how imperial peoples understood themselves and their subjects. Consider the role of intelligence gathering in imperial administration. Churchill had access to detailed reports about political movements, economic conditions, and social tensions throughout the empire. This information allowed colonial authorities to anticipate and suppress resistance before it could become dangerous. But intelligence gathering also shaped perception in subtle ways. Reports focused on threats to imperial authority rather than legitimate grievances. Local officials, whose careers depended on maintaining order, emphasized security concerns over humanitarian issues. The very categories used to analyze colonial situations, tribal loyalty, civilizational level, capacity for self-government, embedded imperial assumptions about racial hierarchy and political development. Churchill's correspondence with colonial governors reveals how these information systems influenced policy. Reports about unrest in Kenya emphasize the primitive savagery of Mau Mau fighters rather than the legitimate grievances that drove the rebellion. Intelligence about Indian nationalism focuses on the dangers of chaos and partition rather than the obvious desire for self-determination. This selective perception was not deliberate deception, but structural blindness built into imperial information systems. Colonial administrators who reported uncomfortable truths about imperial policies found their careers stalled. Intelligence officers who emphasized local grievances over security threats were considered unreliable. The system rewarded those who told imperial authorities what they wanted to hear. The military dimension of imperial control was equally sophisticated. Churchill understood that successful colonial rule required not just superior firepower, but superior mobility, communication, and logistics. British forces could suppress rebellions not because they were more numerous, but because they could concentrate force more effectively at points of resistance. The psychological dimension may have been most important of all. Imperial ideology convinced not just rulers, but many of the ruled that European dominance was natural and inevitable. Educational systems taught colonial subjects to admire European achievements while denigrating their own cultures. Economic policies created dependence on imperial markets and technologies. Political arrangements co-opted local elites by giving them stakes in continued colonial rule. Churchill mastered all these technologies of control, but he also became their prisoner. The very effectiveness of imperial systems convinced him that they were just and necessary. The compliance of many colonial subjects seemed to prove their contentment with British rule. The economic benefits that flowed to Britain appeared to vindicate the civilizing mission. When these systems began breaking down after World War II, Churchill could not understand why. In his mind, decolonization represented not the natural desire of peoples for self-government, but ingratitude toward benevolent rulers. The violence that accompanied independence struggles reflected not the desperation of oppressed peoples, but their incapacity for civilized politics. As we near the end of our extended examination, we must confront the most difficult question of all. What do we do with this knowledge? How do societies process the recognition that their heroes were also architects of oppression? How do we balance gratitude for genuine achievements with acknowledgement of terrible costs? The easy answers, complete condemnation or willful ignorance, both fail us. Complete condemnation ignores the real benefits that Churchill's leadership provided, particularly during World War II. It also assumes a moral superiority over past generations that future generations will likely find as questionable as we find Churchill's imperial convictions. Willful ignorance is equally inadequate. It perpetuates the myths that enabled imperial oppression in the first place. It dishonors the memory of those who suffered under imperial rule. Most dangerously, it prevents us from recognizing similar patterns in our own time and our own behavior. The path forward requires what we might call historical humility, the recognition that moral progress is real but incomplete, that every generation's understanding is partial and provisional, that the heroes of one era may be the villains of another. This humility should inspire both gratitude and vigilance. Gratitude for the freedoms and opportunities that previous generations, however imperfectly, helped secure. Vigilance against the complacency and self-righteousness that enabled their worst failures. Churchill's legacy, properly understood, serves as a warning against several persistent human temptations. The temptation to believe that good intentions justify harmful methods. The temptation to assume that our current understanding of morality is final and complete. The temptation to trust that good people will automatically make good choices under pressure. It also warns against the inverse temptations that afflict our own time. The temptation to judge all past figures by contemporary standards without considering the constraints they faced. The temptation to assume that moral progress is inevitable and irreversible. The temptation to believe that recognizing past injustices exempts us from committing present ones. Modern debates about Churchill often reflect these competing temptations. His defenders tend to emphasize context while minimizing harm. His critics tend to emphasize harm while minimizing context. Both approaches miss the deeper lesson, that human beings are capable of both extraordinary heroism and extraordinary blindness, often simultaneously. The statues of Churchill that dot the landscape of the English-speaking world will continue to generate controversy. Some will be removed, others will be contextualized, still others will remain unchanged. But the real monuments to Churchill's legacy are not made of bronze or marble, but of the ongoing conversation about power, responsibility, and moral judgment that his life continues to provoke. This conversation is itself a form of moral progress. The fact that we can now see Churchill's limitations clearly represents an expansion of human sympathy that previous generations could not achieve. The fact that we struggle with how to remember him honestly reflects a commitment to historical truth that earlier societies often lacked. Yet we should not congratulate ourselves too quickly. Future generations will doubtless identify blind spots in our own moral vision that seem as obvious to them as Churchill's imperial convictions seem to us. They will wonder how we could have been so obtuse about injustices that seem clear in hindsight, just as we wonder about his generation's acceptance of racial hierarchy. This recognition should inspire both humility about our own limitations and determination to do better than our predecessors. It should encourage us to question our own assumptions as rigorously as we question Churchill's, to examine our own complicity in systems of oppression as honestly as we examine his. In the end, Winston Churchill remains what he always was, a mirror in which we see reflected our own moral complexities and contradictions. His story forces us to confront uncomfortable truths about the nature of leadership, the persistence of prejudice, and the human capacity for both greatness and terrible error. The man who saved democracy was also the defender of empire. The voice that inspired millions was also the advocate of oppression. The leader who understood the necessity of fighting fascism was also blind to the fascism inherent in imperial rule. These contradictions cannot be resolved through clever argumentation or historical contextualization. They can only be acknowledged and learned from. Churchill's greatest gift to posterity may be precisely these contradictions. They remind us that moral progress is not a simple matter of replacing bad people with good people, but of expanding our understanding of who deserves moral consideration. They warn us that the same qualities that make someone heroic in one context may make them monstrous in another. Most importantly, they challenge us to examine our own assumptions as rigorously as we examine his. What beliefs do we take for granted that future generations will find as appalling as we find Churchill's racial theories? What systems of oppression do we participate in while convincing ourselves that we are serving higher purposes? What moral blind spots prevent us from seeing the harm we cause in pursuit of what we consider noble goals? These are not comfortable questions, but they are necessary ones. For in the end, the greatest danger is not that we might remember Churchill incorrectly, but that we might fail to apply the lessons of his life to our own choices and our own time. The bronze statue in Parliament Square will weather and eventually crumble. The books will be rewritten, the speeches reinterpreted, the legacy reassessed by each new generation. But the fundamental questions that Churchill's life raises about power, morality, and human nature will endure as long as human beings struggle with the responsibilities of leadership and the challenges of living together in complex societies. Winston Churchill was both a hero and a problem, both the savior of democracy and the architect of oppression. Understanding how he could be both may be the key to understanding ourselves and our own potential for both greatness and terrible error. In a world where authoritarianism again threatens democracy, where ancient prejudices persist despite moral progress, and where the powerful continue to justify the suffering of the powerless, these lessons have never been more urgent. The man is dead. The myth endures. But the questions his life raises about the nature of heroism, the corruption of power, and the possibility of moral progress remain as vital today as they were in his time. For in confronting these questions honestly, we honor not just Churchill's memory, but our own obligation to do better than those who came before us. And perhaps, in doing so, we might become worthy of the gratitude of those who will come after us.